We have 4 more questions that have been posed on the chat here, and I want to be mindful of your time, but I'm hoping we can at least get.
Yeah, we're good.
4.
We're good.
One of them was sent to me privately and just said, hey, I'm having trouble typing this out. Can I just ask my question? And that would be from Matt. So Matt, take it away.
Yep.
Hey there, Drew.
Hey, how you doing, Matt?
I'm feeling a tension on the inclusion front lately, which I don't know how to talk about it other than talk about my specific circumstance, but I think the tension is universal.
Yeah.
And there's 2 examples. The shorter one being, I'm sure not uncommon in this room. I pastor and go to a primarily, in our own case, exclusively white church. There's been some talk about could we maybe have a, sister church or something. And it almost feels somehow more awkward in this time we're living in of mass protesting to approach a Black church and say, hey, can we build a relationship, right? I did have the thought, because I have some clergy connections, of saying, could we join your small groups? Might be more hospitable than, I'm feeling the same tension in a local interfaith group where kind of the people emailing around to run the meetings are not exclusively, but primarily white. And the people who end up replying and making the decisions are indeed exclusively white. We have felt awkward about this for a while. It's also a fairly young group, but there's also, I don't know if we're being overly sensitive, but we've been really hesitant to reach out to some of the Black clergy and say, we really need your voice, because we don't want to be like, I mean, you're Black, that's why we're calling you. We all know it. You know what I mean? Or creating a tokenism effect, or, and so if you can speak to this tension of how do well-intentioned white people who want to be inclusive, how do they invite more Black voices in without seeming like, I hope my question is clear, because I'm still even struggling on how to word it, but I've been feeling this for several months already.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, the one thing that I think is maybe helpful to think about is the fact that sometimes, especially, and this is focusing first on your first example, right, around the churches and connecting. Sometimes what Black churches want and what white churches want are not the same thing as it relates to dealing with racism, right? And so sometimes the white churches want relationships. And usually, a lot of times, especially in these moments, Black churches, they want justice, right? They want change. They want policies change. They want funding for their kids and their children. So sometimes just the desires are not always aligned. And so I do think there's something meaningful about maybe, allowing for majority white congregations to allow their own desires to be secondary, to be put on the back burner as not the primary objective. And sometimes those things can still get accomplished, but through other means, right? And so there might be ways in which, reaching out and saying, like, if there's ways that you guys want to provide leadership in this community, like, we're here to follow, and we're willing to put our, boots to the ground and do the work, and we'll follow your lead, and just letting them know, right, that if they wanted to do something, if there was actions that they want to be involved in, that they're willing to. Now, granted, I should also, just to be, as I talked about the spectrum of Black churches, there's a spectrum of, Black people, there's also a spectrum of Black churches, and their own inclinations are not always the same, and they're depending on traditions and theology and all kinds of things, how they want to enter into those relationships are also different, right? But there are certainly right now, I've heard from Black clergy in particular, even folks who are not normally as justice-oriented Black clergy, I've heard them say, I don't want any kind of holding hands and like, we're going to have to change something, and so that's kind of like the rhetoric that I've heard, even from folks that normally are not even talking like that. And so my take would be is it's not necessarily to not extend the hand, but it's not to predetermine what that's going to be and then invite them into our stuff, right, as a white congregation, but rather just allow them to know that you're willing to enter into their stuff if we're, we're willing to join in with your work if we're invited. We won't impose anything. We'll come, we'll be willing to follow the instructions and leadership that's already organized. And please call us out if it ever seems like we're not, right? Like, I think like that probably would be received in a different kind of way, especially if there's congregations that want to work on something that will kind of better the community, that might be a better strategy for going about that work. And maybe that then answers the broader question, right, around the interfaith work and stuff like that. And so, I mean, I much rather, I'll talk about just myself in terms of in Harrisburg, like I have, you know, a very racially diverse set of friends and connections that I have, but I don't spend time with a lot of the chat and shoes on race and things like that, where that's not, you know, if I'm getting paid to do the work, I'll come in and do training, things like that. But I'd much rather get to know folks co-laboring, where we link arms together and working on behalf of something. So that's been the context in which I'm building those relationships personally. It's actually in co-laboring together for the flourishing of my neighborhood and for my neighbors, right? And I think that that's a great opportunity for us to kind of allow that to be a space and a context in which those relationships, which I think many white people are yearning for those relationships, but I think that maybe if it can be yielded to the broader goal of struggling for justice in your local community, might be one strategy. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not, if you have a follow-up to that question, Matt.
No, only in that I think that's very helpful. In the second case I gave, we're trying to be a little sensitive of, there's a weird tension, and maybe you can speak to this. On one hand, clearly we need the Black voice when we're shaping racial justice issues. On the other hand, as well-meaning liberals, we're trying to show some sensitivity to, this is our problem too, and you might be tired right now, and maybe we shouldn't call you and demand this work of you, right. You know, and so we're struggling a little bit with that tension too. If you could speak to that, and then I'll yield the floor.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you already said it, right? That there's ways in which I think white people can drain Black leadership, right? And in doing so in a way that actually absolves them from doing their own work, right? And so I often talk about, like, there's white work to be done, right? And so white people actually have to take the time, read and learn and grow, and like there's work to be done that Black people don't need to do everything as it relates to even racial justice, right? There's places, their voices are important in the midst of all of this stuff. There needs to be accountability, all that kind of stuff in some form, but there's white work to be done, right? And so I think to not absolve oneself and one's community of doing work is important. And at the same time, how do we do that in such a way that also creates space to yield to, and actually, I often say, you know, what's the principle? Like, how do we put into practice Jesus is the first or last and the last are first, where normally where white people are always leading, is there opportunities where white folks can come and follow and yield to somebody else's objectives and mission if they're invited in, right? I mean, and often, I mean, the surprise has always been for centuries is that Black people actually do invite white people in, are more willing than probably maybe we should be, right? To invite white people in into that work alongside of us. But then how can white people just make sure that they're doing the work so that they can do that well and not creating more harm in the process? Yeah. All right, let's see. I'm sure
so Sarah was next. As conversations begin with our white churches, what are the red flags to watch for in helping the conversation along?
What are the red flags? Well, there's a whole bunch of different directions, right? The conversations can go. So, I mean, it's a little bit of a tricky question. I can give you at least some things that I've seen, right? I think one thing I've seen, and one thing that you may not have noticed, but I'll give you a little secret about my book is I don't use the word white privilege as a part of my framework. I don't know, some people might be surprised that that's not a part of the language. I talk about systems of advantage, right? But I actually don't use the white privilege framework. And I actually think that sometimes um, it cripples white people from doing the work because it's not always as helpful of as a term as I think many think it is. And so my concern with the language, and I think what I've seen is that I've sat in places where, you know, white folks are sitting around and they're all like, they're crying and they're feeling guilty and they're all lamenting their white privilege, right? And then like, that's like the work, literally, like that becomes the work, is them just feeling bad about themselves because they're white and they have white privilege. I'm thinking like, this cannot be the work. This can't be the end goal. Like, we don't need just white people sitting around crying all day. Like that's not helping anybody, you know, not good for your psyche. And it's certainly not making a better world for anybody else either. So that kind of white liberal, just feeling bad about oneself, you won't hear me advocating for that at all. I do think that people have to go through a process that can be disorienting and may include grief. And I mean, if you have never been told the truth, it's a lot to kind of grapple with, right? In terms of one's own sense of identity. But how do we imagine the work in terms of a way that's actually producing us to actually become anti-racist and pursue justice in the world, right? So for me, white privilege is a very individualistic term. It's about yourself, and it's very passive. This just thing that you just have, and you're not told what to do. I mean, sometimes the best thing people tell you is to steward your white privilege, which I think is a bad idea. But that's the best because it's just a strange term. I think that it's much better to have an analysis of our society, to talk about systems and structures in our society that are unjust, right? Like education funding, right? Like, and then all of a sudden when you can see the unjust systems in our society, it's pretty clear what needs to happen, right? We need to make sure that this funding is equitable, all right? Like the work becomes clear when it's not just a passive thing that you just hold within your heart, but how do we name the systems of advantage and disadvantage and then say, how do we navigate this faithfully? What does it look like as followers of Jesus to respond faithfully in the way of Jesus to the world that we see before us? I think that is a whole different thing. So I do think it's really important to not get stuck in and I will say this, just to be fair, like there are decades of white people who that's the only language they had, and they made it work and they've grown from that. And so I don't want to deny that it's not impossible for anybody to do that work. I just think it's a muddied term. It's unclear. It gets used in a variety of different ways. And so it's not my preference. I think that there's better ways I think that we can describe what's the actual patterns of what we see around us in our society. So that's my preference. So that's one area, is the white privilege, white guilt, thinking that the work is just feeling bad about being white. I don't think that's not healthy, I don't think. I think that conversations can get caught up in just being an intellectual exercise, right? If it's a predominantly educated white middle class or upper class congregation, folks can do book studies really well and then it's just another topic to discuss, right? But it's not necessarily a transformative thing that's going to actually change how we live in the world, right? How we engage our community and our world and resist conforming to these centuries, the patterns that have been unfolding for so long. And so I think that that's a temptation to watch out. I think we can also watch out centering. There's a way in which you have to both do white work, but also not just center white people and everything. Like, how do we get out of, what does it mean to allow other people's stories and the needs of others to kind of orient us, right, in a different kind of way, where we're a little dislodged from just occupying the center as we normally have. And so I think that, as congregations have conversations, they're gonna have to be very attentive, listen carefully to what questions and concerns are being raised. Is it just about us and our kids and, our family and this and that? Are we willing to kind of be unsettled and to kind of engage in a way that kind of removes us from the center some, so that other people's realities and lived experiences can be taken more seriously? So I think those are other aspects. I would also, and this is more just a suggestion more than a way that it can go wrong, but on a positive note, I often encourage congregations to do some race and place work, which is to say, study the lands in the community that you inhabit, right? What's the history of that land? Who were its first inhabitants, right? So I can say in Pennsylvania and Central, I live on Susquehannock lands, right? It's helpful to have a sense of how that land's got to become, if it is a majority white land, what's that story of the land, right? What policies was there ever a time where white people were invited in and black people were excluded or pushed out? Or was there redlining, sundown towns, convict leases, restricted deeds and covenants on homes, right? There's all kinds of policies and practices that shape the way communities actually, none of this is organic. Communities, they're just all white. It didn't happen organically. There's actually things that were done throughout history to create particular ways of demographics for particular communities. And so what's the story of the land as it relates to race and the people groups that have lived there at different points and who's been pushed off and all of that? Because there's something about knowing that history that kind of can orient you in terms of having a better sense of, maybe a sense of mission in your local place, right? And maybe also a sense of being able to resist continuing that pattern, because now churches are wrestling with like regentrification of communities, right? And now black communities because now it's the fad to move back in. Now sometimes black communities are getting displaced once again, right? And so how do we be sensitive so that we can both do this in a way that doesn't just override those who are most vulnerable? And so I think being attentive to the land and race and place is actually a really neat way. And it's a way to have a sense of story for one's own church and a sense of direction, right? To do that horn. But it requires some homework, right? To do a little digging and understanding about your own region and what shapes its current life today.
That is awesome. So the last question that I had was, because Kate's question was answered by you already. So we have Missy, and she was talking about the difference between not being racist versus being anti-racist. And could you describe that a little bit better?
Yeah, so I mean, the best way I think to think about it is to think about like riding an escalator, right? Like if you're standing on an escalator, you're still moving, right? And if you want to make any ground in the opposite direction, you've got to literally make some real actual grounds and efforts to go in the opposite direction. And I think that's kind of how racism works in our society. If you understand that literally we have literally centuries and centuries of inertia that's shaping. That's why when I said earlier about like most white people's lives are have this racial distinctiveness to it, right? In terms of the choices that they have made over and over and over again, even though I don't think most white people are thinking about, they're not saying, oh, I want to make an all white friend group today, right? Or I want to be an all white church. And I don't think anyone's doing that. So even if you're not intentionally like joining neo-Nazis and KKK, it doesn't necessarily mean that your life is not going to be conforming to racist patterns anyway, right? And so not being racist, in some ways, it's not even a reality in terms of there's no neutral place in a racist society. There's either you're going in one direction or you're going the other direction, because standing still is still going in a direction. And so it actually takes intentionality. So this anti-racist language is to say, I'm intentionally going to resist conformity to the racist ideas, to the racist patterns, to the racist ways of interacting with others, right? I'm going to be intentional about learning, unlearning and learning, right? All over again. And so, I mean, I think intentionality is the key word there, right? That you're going to do the work, you're going to study to understand our history better. You're going to be intentional about, like when I talk about, spaces in terms of, it's easy without even thinking about it to think, this place is a place where I belong, and this place is a place I do not belong, right? But solely based on race, without even thinking about it in that way. People just have this, you're socialized into it. So what does it mean to be anti-racist, to resist the ways that we're formed into the world to identify and to move and to have a sense of belonging that qualifies our humanity in a way that doesn't reflect God, and that allows us to be apathetic to the suffering of others, right? I don't think, like, as followers of Jesus, you can be apathetic to, I mean, I think that's one of the great reasons why the Anabaptist tradition, I think, makes it more clear than many other Christian traditions, that, not saying that others don't also call you to follow Jesus, but I think Anabaptists have understood that it's not just accepting Jesus into your heart, like, you actually follow Jesus in your life and how you practice and what you say, right? You're discipled into it actively, and so that you live in a particular way. And I think that to be a disciple of Jesus, I think faithfully, if he's the same one who calls us to not go around, but to go through Samaria, right? Or to stand in solidarity with those who are vulnerable and those who are poor and those who are oppressed, the least and last and lost of society. If that's the Jesus, then it seems like we have to be intentionally anti-racist to be following Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, right? That's how at least I understand it. And so, but to do so means we have to actually understand how race works and how racism works and how it's shaping people without us even realizing it. Because I think that's the hardest part about it is that you can be socialized to have a way of seeing and understanding the world and yourself and your own community that might be harmful, and you've done it passively, almost like a gas, right, in the air. You can just kind of breathe it in, and you take it in without even knowing it. And so we have to be intentional, I think, about resisting it. And for the church, this is especially important because the little known secret, but it's the truth, is that the church started the modern racism as we know it. The idea of white supremacy as we know it today came out of the church. It was a distorted way that the church, in the midst of the colonial era, it went from Christian supremacy to birthing white supremacy. I mean, literally, if you read 17th century history and you hear them say Christian, they mean white people. If they say white, they mean Christian, white Christians, right? Europeans, right? Like, those words were synonymous at that time. It's only over time that they've kind of slowly have had different meanings, but there was a time in which they were the same thing. And so white supremacy is actually a theological distortion that the church birthed. During colonialism, during conquest and slavery, these ideas were being developed. It's not that ethnic centrism, like, there was some kind of ethnic prejudice that has always existed in humanity, tribalism, and all the different things, right? But this specific form of modern racism as we know it, white supremacy, the racial hierarchy as we think about it today, and how we break out humanity in these categories, that was birthed out of the church. And so for us, we actually have an extra responsibility, not because we're the ones that created it, but nonetheless, we also recognize as the church that we should be responsible for the harm that the church has caused, because we're also belonging in Christ, right? And so we've got to take responsibility for those things as well. So I think there's extra responsibility for us as the church, not only from an individual standpoint, just being faithful as followers of Jesus, but because we want to set right what was wronged in the past as well, which has deeply wounded our globe, right? White supremacy is not just an American thing, it's a global problem, and has deeply impacted people all around the world in a variety of different ways.
So Drew, you have sparked something in us, and now I have two more questions. Are you up for that?
Yeah, I'm good.
No,
I'm fine. I'm actually good. Yeah,
okay.
Let's go.
So Richard was another one who can't type it out because he can't put it together. So come on, Richard, tell us what you have, and then we'll go to Laura's question.
All right. So I was just thinking about how, well, Angela said she rewrote her sermon. This is the anniversary of the Charleston, South Carolina shooting. She rewrote her sermon on that day, and I believe I did as well. Back then. When George Floyd was murdered in front of our eyes, I didn't feel that I could speak to that situation. I could not speak into that situation as a white man. And so I was familiar with somebody you mentioned yesterday in your talk, and I want to get to that too, with Otis Moss Jr., Otis Moss, the third sermon, on prophetic grief. So I just played that over my airwaves for my Sunday morning service. because I just feel inadequate, and I felt inadequate. And I think that many people that are gathered on this call this evening feel inadequate to speak to problems of race, because we have this kind of identity, this thing where it's not my problem. It's not a problem for me, so it's easy to ignore. And I think that we're getting, especially those on the call, we want to get past that in that area of our lives. And so I listened to your talk with Jared McKenna yesterday, where you were back and forth, and you listed, you guys listed people of influence who we could read. So who else, and I just want to ask you this, who else should we be reading besides you? I made a list. I watched that today, but I just kind of want to hear it from you and want everybody to hear that from you. You stretched this group immensely just with your book and your work, but who else should we be reading?
Yeah, let's see.
Or following or whatever.
Yeah.
Just a couple of people maybe. I've got
I'll name a couple people.
Yeah.
So theologians wise, who will push you, right? You have to wrestle. But I think it's really important that white Christians read James Cone. And especially early James Cone, which is actually the hardest for white people to read, right? Cone is angry, right? This is during the Black Power movement. Dr. King has been assassinated. And he's angry, and he's wrestling with how white supremacist Christianity has been at different times, and how even as a theologian, he has been excluded from the conversation at times. And so you hear that anger, and actually, I think it's important to receive that as a gift, actually, right? I know usually white people sometimes will deflect and say, oh, angry Black man, angry Black woman, and think that that's a reason to dismiss. And I say, no, it's actually the opposite, right? Hear, receive that, listen in, feel his pain. And he's also brilliant too, not just his emotion, but he's brilliant. And there might be, there's times in which there's little times I might disagree with him on this or that. As a Black Anabaptist, we have some slight differences, but overall he's like deeply if you're reading Trouble I've Seen, you've gotten a little bit of Cone indirectly because he's a part of me, right? In terms of I've grappled with him in a variety of ways. And so read it, early King. I know a lot of Christians have jumped straight to The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is probably his easiest. If you're really nervous about being defensive and fragile in terms of Cone, then go there first. But get to the early Cone stuff, right? So he has 3 texts. His very first one was in 1969. It was called Black Theology and Black Power. And then in 1970, he wrote a book called A Black Theology Liberation. And then in 1975, he wrote a book called God of the Oppressed, which is one that I've taught many times. Those 3 early ones, you don't have to read all of them. I mean, unless you're like studying theology, you don't have to, but grab 1 or 2 of those and wrestle with them. It'll be meaningful for you. And then Kelly Brown Douglas has a really important text. She's written a lot of stuff, also kind of known as kind of classical womanist theologians, African-American woman. She has a book called Stand Your Ground. And that's a really good one. It was kind of written in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin and his killing, but really kind of released right around the time in which Ferguson happened and everything there. So it was just a really timely text, but it also does some history with theology. And I think that would just be a helpful way to think about things. Maybe I'll add one more. Let's see. Let's go with, maybe we'll go with a lighter one. So in terms of just readability, so Austin Channing Brown, she has a book called I'm Still Here. Very, very popular text. Very accessible, but kind of as a Black woman's experience, kind of narrating her place in the world and thinking about Black dignity in the midst of that, of the challenges. She's kind of moved through white Christian spaces at different points in her life and kind of narrates and talks through her own experience. And so it's a really helpful text as well. So we'll stop there with those, I guess, for now. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so you answered one, you'd think there'd be one left, but now we have another one. Are you okay with
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm all right. I
Okay.
was planning on, I didn't know how long, but I figured I was gonna, up to 2 hours was gonna be my thing. So I'm not rushing. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I feel less bad then about starting the recording late. So thank you for that. Okay, so Laura had a question about missionary work and work projects given the history of colonialism and white saviorism. She was thinking particularly of your chapter on the invasion.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, one of the things that we can see in the whole missionary is there's an assumption, right? There is, I think, white savior complex is so deeply bound up in white Christianity, in white Christian practice, and Anabaptists are not outside of that, right? Of white savior complex. In fact, I think it looks sometimes a little bit different sometimes, but the need to serve still can get co-opted, I think, in kind of significant ways. One of the things I talk about and I think about is the ways in which the very idea of servanthood has kind of been diluted. Jesus's teaching of servanthood gets diluted because in Jesus's teaching on servanthood, literally it's like emptying of power and kind of, you know, leveling the playing field in some ways as you serve others. Or you think about like foot washing, which is a central practice, right, for Anabaptists. And so what is interesting often when people do Christian service is that there's, in some ways, it's a position out of hierarchy, right? I have everything to give and I'm coming to give and serve you. So it's actually not flattening hierarchy usually when people practice what we call today Christian service. And so I think that there's something there that we've got to really grapple with. Does it mean that we can't do things globally or whatever, or enter into other communities? No, I don't necessarily think so. But I do think that probably what needs to happen more than anything is for white people to see themselves as being in need and not necessarily seeing others as in need, right? For white folks to see themselves as needing to be transformed and needing to find some deliverance, and not just seeing other people as targets for service and for transformation and growth, right? That I think that an imagination that that sees that their own liberation is literally bound up in somebody else's, that can be a much more meaningful way of engaging on those terms, so that you don't come thinking, I have everything to give, but it's like, what does God have? What are the gifts that God has for me? Because I'm not who I need to be fully. And there's something about my own tradition, and I'm using in the most broadest sense, Western Christian tradition, right? That has been a harmful tradition to so many people around the world for centuries. So what is it that I can learn about what it means to be a follower of Jesus more faithfully from these folks, right? How do we enter in a sense of mutuality where we fully see people's humanity and the gifts that they offer, and that we can then somehow beautifully still give and receive and share life, right? And things with others in a way that where nobody leaves the same, right? And I think that is a much more, maybe a better way of doing it. But I think that my suggestion is that white people, the best posture in the midst, given our history, that overall, until that has really happened in some significant ways, right? Some unlearning and unsettling in some significant ways, to learn how to follow. I really, really believe that is, that may be white people's salvation, right? Learning how to follow and to grow and to learn in that context where normally white people are always assumed to be the leaders, and here now all of a sudden they are following. And I think that can be a really beautiful thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that forever, but I think that something really powerful needs to happen in that context to a new discipleship, right? In terms of how to live and interact with others in meaningful ways. So anyway, that's my take. I don't, and that's my take as a Black person that is not a white person, that's not always wrestling with these things the same kind of way. But nonetheless, I do think that those are just actually practices that most people should practice anyhow when you enter into a new place, right? To have the humility, to have the intercultural humility, to know I don't know everything, and that I can't even trust my own eyes. If I go to just get dropped off somewhere in China, right? That's a context that I would be extremely unfamiliar with. And the first thing I should be doing is not telling anybody anything or trying to serve anybody. It's learning, shutting up and learning. That's what Drew Hart needs to shut up and learn as much as he can in that context. And so having the intercultural humility to realize that alone, none less than in light of the broader ways that we've been socialized in the world to interact with others on top of that, I think that that is really important.
Okay, I see from Sarah something about how white Christianity has shaped the interfaith conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think my take is that, so I tend to, most of, if interfaith or multi-faith spaces that I'm working in is very similar to what I said about race, right? That my preference is usually collaborating and getting to know people in my community as we're doing work together for the common good of our city. You know, in fact, literally today, a good Muslim sister reached out to see if I could, you know, do a talk for Juneteenth, right? Now, I won't be able to do it because I'm gonna be heading to Philly, but it's a relationship because we've collaborated in the past together. There's a way in which and I don't know if I have all the language for it, but I felt like it's been, some interfaith spaces are constructed with a kind of white liberal kind of frame in which tolerance and kind of smudging together everyone's, and I don't know, I'm not, it actually, it's not actually creating space for us, for everyone to be fully themselves, right? And so everyone has to kind of lessen themselves rather than can we give and receive and share as fully ourselves, I think is actually something much more beautiful. And for me, again, my context, at least, and that's just maybe preference, but my context is, let's do the work together and get to know each other on the journey, right? And so I love spaces where, you know, in interfaith organizing work where, you know, a Muslim can come and share the teachings from their own tradition, and I can come and talk about the teachings from my tradition, and none of us have to water down who we are and what we believe in. And we can also learn from each other, right? Literally learn from one another and grow and be better people in our understanding of one another in that context. But often, for me, it's in the context of doing the work. Anyway, I don't know if I have all the language for, that's not a lot of the time that I'm spending articulating interfaith stuff, but my inclination is that sometimes our goals are more tolerance related, and it gets mushy and blending in who people are in ways that actually don't allow us to affirm our distinctiveness and our difference also, and that we don't have to be afraid of our differences. And if there's a relationships of trust, obviously, that then that those things can really be really beautiful. So.
I don't know. Does anyone else have something, or are your brains smoking? I think for me, one of the, I'm all fired up now, and now I have to still sit under quarantine. That, you know, like I want to go, but I guess this is the time to order books and read them so that we can have more Zoom conversations. So maybe this is a time to lie fallow and do some of that kind of work.
Yeah, no, and somebody said, or participate in a protest, right? If you can, yeah, safely, but
Yeah,
to
right, right,
do
right.
that work, yeah. But yeah, I do think that, I mean, we should not lose the fact that right now, more Americans, and I use that in the broadest sense, are engaged in conversation around race and racism than at any historic moments in the past, right? Including civil rights. Certainly, I think there's more than that are wanting to have a conversation than even during like the Civil War, right? Like there's something happening at this moment. Now, can just be a fad that can go away, right? That can easily happen. And certainly our news cycle encourages that kind of trendiness. But this could also, if we lean into it, we can allow it to be a kind of kairos moment for the church. And it can be a time for renewal and transformation for the church, and for the church to actually maybe be the church a little bit, right? And bear a better public witness, because we have a bad rap, and it's not because we haven't earned the bad rap in terms of the way that the church has too often been complicit and complacent in racism, silence, if not outright perpetuating the racism itself. And so I think that this can be a time of repentance, of lament, of learning, of growth, of finding a courage in language and to speak and to act, and reinvigorating a sense of mission or vocation as the church, right? What is our calling? What does it mean to be followers of Jesus, who invites us to stand in solidarity with the least? And what does that mean for us here in whatever community that you've placed yourself in, right? This can be a really powerful moment. And so I do hope that we don't waste it, right? That we lean in, that we take this opportunity seriously, yield to the Spirit and what God is doing. I believe that God is doing something, and that we don't want to not be a part of that. You don't want to miss that. And so let's join in with what God is doing at this moment. And so, yeah, I never allow myself to get too optimistic, because I'm a little skeptic sometimes, but I also am a believer that there is something happening right now that folks, we can hop on this train, right? It's moving. We can hop onto this train and be part of the ride. Yeah.
My professor calls that the hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yeah, the hermeneutics of suspicion. That's right. That's right.
I cannot tell you how many people have emailed me from my congregation that have read the book, that have just commented how this has completely opened them up and shaken them up and turned them inside out. It has been such a privilege and an opportunity to do this and to have you here. So we are unbelievably grateful. And I don't know if you've gone through some of the other comments that are directly to you, but we really are a grateful people for having you among us, for doing the work that you've done with your books. I think there will be a long list of pre-orders from this collection. And I know my congregation is planning to have some conversations. I really appreciated the statement that Harrisburg First Church came out with.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that's on your Facebook page, right?
Yeah. I think they posted it a few different places. Yeah.
Right. So if you all want to check that out, you can go to Harrisburg First Church on Facebook. But that's something that we can maybe work with congregationally as we start looking ahead at how we can be better anti-racists.
Yeah. And one thing that, I actually wrote the statement itself, but as a part of, it was a discernment team that kind of decided what direction we were going to go to. But one of the things that we wanted was to not, like, it's easy to just make statements, right? But how do we do it in such a way that it calls us into even greater work, and to confess our own complicity, and to lean into more learning for us as a congregation, and to discern. I mean, we're not an apathetic, passive congregation in terms of neighborhood work, but maybe there's other opportunities for us to be engaged officially and formally as a congregation in terms of work for racial justice. And so it was opportunities for us to lean in deeper as well. And I think that is some of the opportunities that I think all congregations, right, is to just some real actual discernment around, again, sense of vocation and mission and purpose in times like this. Yeah.
We did get another question from Laura on any tips for finding groups doing the work. I mean,
so do you mean like other congregations or like partnerships? Like, so there's something called Faith in Action, which is a national organization that does multi-faith. I think they changed their language now, but I'll just say multi-faith organizing across the country. It's especially led by, it's mostly Black Christian led, but it's a multi-faith, and they're learning to try to, again, more and more create space. And so it looks a little bit different in different, it's like a mother organization in which smaller organizing groups kind of are partnered with them. And so that's one place to look to see if there's any groups that are tied with Faith in Action that are in your local community. One on, maybe it's a little bit more on the evangelical side, but CCDA is more on the community development work stuff, and they would have a list of maybe stuff, partnerships and possibilities for people that are working usually in the city. Not as much on the organizing side, but community development kind of work in the community is also there. And there's other organizations and stuff that would not be affiliated that, I mean, I think it's always good to just make, if you haven't already for your congregations, do an inventory of like, who's doing what, like what work is already happening in the community. Are folks doing work on immigration or whatever it is, right? Just have an awareness, and then it's much easier then to kind of think about partnerships and collaborations when you know what's already happening in your community. Yeah.
I think people are throwing up some resources, but I don't.
Oh, Poor People's Campaign, someone mentioned. Yeah, Poor People's Campaign. You can check to see if that's local for you.
Yeah, this is great. I will save the notes from the chat too, for people who want that. All right, any other questions for Drew or comments?
Could I dare to ask another?
Yeah, that's fine. Fine with me, at least.
I was worried about putting in the chat while Angela's trying to decide to end the meeting or not, and then I'm typing and she's ending it. Drew, I'm fascinated by, even there's so many white people coming to the anti-racism party right now, which is great, but we lack skills that the African-American community has been nurturing and passing on for generations and centuries. And I'm specifically fascinated by perhaps a lack of patience of dealing with people who aren't there yet.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to the tension of staying friends and wanting to, quote, recruit, but when is that more healthy or less healthy? When do you break a relationship? Because I think it's very easy to be like, especially like say on social media right now, oh, you posted All Lives Matter, I'll just hide your feed and I'm not friends with you anymore. But
Yeah.
maybe that's, when is that good for our mental health? But maybe we need to maintain that relationship, because how does anything ever change? As white people, we have no skill set on this. And what's your advice?
Yeah, I got strong feelings on this. I think white Christians who begin to get down the journey can be extremely ungracious with those folks who are not there, and forget how quickly it's interesting. Like folks who, like, I've seen folks who have literally like learned like a year ago, and now they have no time for anybody else. I'm like, you were just there. Like that was just like yesterday, like what's going on? So I not only do I think it's not gracious, but it's actually not helpful to just cut everyone off. for me, I'll just say this, as a Black man, like, I don't want white folks who are have anti-racist commitments, or on the journey at least, to be cutting off everybody else who doesn't. That doesn't help anything. You actually have more impacts and influence in your roles. I would much rather it's okay if people cut you off, right? Let people cut you off. If somebody else wants to burn that bridge, then by all means, that's just a part of the journey, because you had integrity in your relationships to speak up and be honest, and hold people accountable. Like, that's fine. But shame on you, I think, for if folks are just cutting people off left and right because you're just tired of having racist people around. I think that's not. Now, granted, I will say this as one caveat, like, obviously, you have to be careful about just the mental health and stuff like that. So, but I think, like, those things can be controlled by not being on social media as much when you need to, but there's a certain amount of some resilience that white people need to develop and build. Black people have to deal with white people all the time, and it's much more traumatic, I think, for us, right? And so build up some resilience, figure out how to do it in healthy ways, find mental health practices, whatever that you got to do, learn when you got to get off. But I think it's much better for you to stay in those relationships, and don't be the ones to burn the relationships. Unless, the only difference I would say, like, social media, like, if someone is coming onto your page and is assaulting the dignity of Black people in a way that's harmful to others, then that's not the context in which maybe it's more harmful to have them there or not. But in general, be in relationship, be in conversation, stick with it, right? Have some stick with itness about your relationships. I'm actually this Sunday going to be preaching on Matthew 10:34-39 at Harrisburg First Church, which is the passage where, it's about Jesus warning them about families being divided against one another, right? And I do think, some of what I'm going to say is the gospel is divisive because it's not neutral on these things. Jesus was not neutral as it relates to the poor and to the Samaritans and vulnerable women and those who are marginalized and stigmatized in his society. He's not neutral. He takes sides, right? The kingdom of God explicitly says first last and the last first, right? It's not neutral on these things. However, that's not the goal. The goal, like, even as Jesus says, not peace, but has not come to bring peace, but division. He's just describing the inevitability of what happens when the kingdom of God clashes with our world that is not yielded to God, right? That it's going to be divisive in that kind of way. But the goal is not to be divisive. We're inviting people into the reign of God, and some folks will push against that, and others will not, right? And so, how do we live with integrity in our relationships and be committed to following Jesus and realizing that, like, the way that Matthew is describing it, the gospel, or Jesus is describing it, it's a loss to have family divided against one. No one is desiring that. It's not trying to divide families apart. It's that sometimes following Jesus will take us to have commitments in the way of Jesus that will sever and fracture relationships. And so I think those two things are different, right? And so anyway, that's my take, right? I might be a little hard on white folks on this one, but I really need white folks to stay in relationships with their family members that are saying things out of the pocket. I need you actually to be there to say that ain't right. That's not right. And tell the truth, right? And say, bear witness to something else, and do some work, do the reading, so you can actually say something intelligent in response to what's been said, right? And so that's, I think, the more important work, to show up, and that will have greater impact in the long run than just cutting folks off. So that's my take, right? There probably could be other arguments for more nuances and all of this, but I just want to push there, to not follow that impulse of just cutting people off. I don't think as healthy. And I think some of those temptations, some of those impulses are not healthy, I don't think, either. And I think that's where, to just think about the journeys that we've been on, each of us, right? To remember where you've come from, should hopefully help us be a little bit more gracious with others, the grace that we've received that we can extend also to others. Yeah. And
Right.
but grace is not, let me just say, sorry. Grace is not saying anything. It's showing up with integrity. The grace is that you're still in relationship and you're not giving up on the person. That's where the grace is, right? But then you show up with integrity and you speak truthfully in love with them. Yeah.
Right. And what I was thinking, maybe this is too simplistic, but it's taken us 400 years to get here, right? So maybe we could have a little patience for somebody. I don't know.
Right. And what like one of the things I talked about is like, how do we have patience and urgency at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. Like both of those things, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? There's a sense of urgency because of the impact that it's having on people, right? People are being harmed. Right now we have a couple million people locked up all across the country, right? There's an urgency, right? And at the same time, a patience in terms of the graciousness to not give up on people and to persevere with them, right? That those things can be held at the same time. And yeah, anyway, I think I've made my point.
Yeah, awesome. All right, friends. Anybody else? Do you all know how to make your little clapping emojis? Your little clapping reactions? Yay, Lynn knows. Yay! Drew, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope that, I know this is a really busy time for you. I hope that you are finding moments of rest for yourself, moments of Sabbath. And, oh, somebody pointed out that the hands are white. That's stinky. What's the deal with that? Oh, okay. Oh, you can change it? Okay, well, we'll deal with that later. Any final words for us?
No, just stay on the journey, right? I think that's the most important thing is if you haven't been on the journey, to get on the journey. And if you are on the journey, stay on the journey, right? Let's keep growing and learning. And sometimes, like, I think one temptation or one thing that I've seen some white folks get afraid of is so afraid of making mistakes once they realize this, that they do nothing. And some of what it means to kind of release your whiteness, so to speak, is to be okay with not being perfect and to making mistakes and putting yourself in the place where you have to be the student. And that doesn't mean be sloppy and careless with other people, right? But it does mean that you will sometimes make mistakes, even as you're learning and you're trying your best. And what you do then is you confess and you apologize and you try to make it right, right? And if you're lucky, you've got someone in your corner that will give you grace, then that's wonderful, right? And if not, you still will learn more from having actually made the mistake than not doing it at all. In some ways, becoming anti-racist is more arts than science, right? So you're learning as you have the conversation, you're growing in the process of it. And so as you sculpt, right, you can kind of refine and grow in the process as well. And so stay on the journey. And yeah, excited that you all are, I'm always honored when folks take my work seriously and are wrestling with it and grappling with it. I've always wanted it to be especially read in groups and not just individuals. Obviously individuals is fine too, but I love when I see groups who actually spend time to actually dialogue together and discern together. So it's really exciting. And of course I have to plug again my own book to pre-order if you get the chance, Who Will Be a Witness, coming out September 1st. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you everybody for being here. It was so great to see all your faces. I miss you so much. And I will see you soon, I hope. I hope. Blessings, Drew. Thank you again.
Yep, thank you. Yep, take
Goodbye,
care.
everybody.